Hi everyone, this is Ali-John, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman, author, and this is Brother, Sister, Strangers video podcast, and a lot of our viewers have some topics that come up that are familiar to us in terms of having a sibling, for example, that erupts in anger in an unprovoked type of way, and how do we respond to that type of situation is what we're going to try to answer today. How do you avoid that type of situation from escalating? So I'm really glad that you're here today, Fern. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. It's always great to be here, Ali-John. Really, what you're talking about is often rooted in narcissism, narcissistic rage. And one of the things I've discovered on the pages that you offer, as well as other sites and some of the surveys I've done, is it's very common to have estrangement when there's a narcissistic sibling in the mix. And so I think this is a really important topic because obviously we really want to avoid escalating this kind of situation.
You're absolutely right. I think that this is something that happens a number of times, and people are often wondering, like, what do we do? How do we handle this? And oftentimes we need to remind ourselves, of course, that this isn't about us. It's basically an emotional-based response that our sibling can have that can already just throw more gas into the fire to an already strained relationship, So
I think it's interesting that narcissistic disorders or personality traits are often also called antagonistic personality. Yeah. And the reason is that these people do have hot heads and quick tempers. And it's somewhat deceptive because they have other wonderful qualities, and you get roped into this sense of safety because you enjoy them at a particular moment, but suddenly they change. It's almost like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation, and you are caught in something much bigger than yourself.
You're absolutely right. And I think that some of these situations play themselves out in terms of false accusations, gaslighting, silent treatment, volatile arguments, in some cases, manipulation. And it can even go as far as to full-blown insults, physical or emotional threats, or outright violence, if we're not careful.
That's pretty frightening. And actually, to your point, some situations are so dangerous and so violent that it's best to simply cut off. And I'm always reminded of that when I read more of some of the comments on Facebook, because some people are dealing with situations that simply are untenable.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that sometimes you have to throw in the towel when your emotional or physical safety is at risk and such, and there's just too much volatility, and that's the thing that happens, is that, this can be happening a little bit at a time in that way, and people may not be aware of just how it can grind them down. And people that are empathic can feel very bewildered about what's happened, because they'll wonder, like, what did I do or say that may have caused this, if they think about the criticism they're receiving from the narcissistic sibling and such.
Yeah, there's a lot of blindsiding in this. Mm-hmm. So you think you're going along and everything's fine and there's some attunement, and then all of a sudden you have hit a button, usually where they feel threatened or abandoned, and they overreact in such a way that you really don't know what to say or do.
Well, that's the thing, right? So you can't really predict when these things happen, right? That's the thing. You don't know when they're being injured, or that somehow their own sense of self is affected, right? Because of their own insecurities and such. So you may be apprehensive of going into family meetings or certain things, and perhaps be more privy to some of their bullying tactics, and things of that nature, where even some family members may be enabling things because they just don't know what to do with it. So you're left in the position where you're having to kind of think for yourself, well, how do I manage that, or how do I navigate through that?
So I'm going to tell you how I manage that, okay?
Sure.
I run all of these questions in my head. What did I do? Why did he react that way? Mm-hmm. How can I fix this? That's really productive.
Hmm.
You know,
If-
I think there's a tendency to ruminate, and when somebody does something like that, I immediately start to evaluate my own behavior.
you're right, and that's the thing that's really important for us to be careful of, because we need to condition ourselves to make sure that we don't take this on. Because oftentimes that's the danger, is that we can tend to take stuff on that's just not ours, and to recognize that their actions and behaviors are really independent of us. That's a skill unto itself.
Right.
Mhm.
And my latest thing is to constantly remind myself, I didn't do that. I'm not responsible for that. That's his behavior. I can't control that.
Exactly. So coming back to what you can control versus what you don't control in your interaction is very important. So obviously you want to remain calm, of course, in situations like that too, right? Because if you start to get emotional yourself, then what you're doing is, that might just increase their defenses, and you could be baited in some ways, if you're not careful. So I always think that that's an especially important way to come into it.
Yeah, so I think what I'm really saying here, and I think you're addressing, is that my tendency was always to personalize this and to
Yep.
take it on as my own. And the important response is actually to depersonalize it and not take it on as my own.
Yes, very much. That's the thing that happens to a number of us in our community, is that we take it on because we somehow think this is our problem to solve in some ways, or there's something we must do about them, when in fact, we have zero control over them, over their own way of thinking and doing things. So, it's important to come back to us. What are the things we can do, right? So,
But I just want to say before you jump into what we can do is that my other first response is to get extremely flustered.
yeah.
So it's hard to have the presence of mind to think, okay, wait a minute, this is not me. This is not about me. This is about him.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so
What you're describing is kind of like, I like to call this feeling as though you're in a theatrical play. It becomes so surrealistic that you get caught up in this and you're wondering, where is this coming from? How am I somehow a part of this in that way? It's just so outlandish, and it's really, really important, like you said, perhaps to kind of work on achieving a certain sense of calmness when it comes to that. So self-soothing techniques, meditation techniques are very important in cases like this, where just focusing on your breath, for example, is enough that can help you have something else of a focus than what's going on around you in that way. So that's important.
well, the other impulse is to people please. And then, of course, you find yourself enabling, which is completely the wrong response. And in a lot of ways, it all feels like a minefield.
Yeah.
Where you're going to step in the wrong hole, no matter what you do.
Exactly. And I think that that's the thing that's really, really important to be careful of, because there's a difference between just fawning and forgetting about your own needs over time. But I think at the same time, to be able in some ways to, defuse a situation is also important. And defusing a situation by sometimes agreeing with the person can sometimes be a way to kind of bring the tension down. Like, for example, we'll just say, oh, you're always talking first. If they accuse you of something like that, oh, you're always talking first. Well, okay, maybe you're right. I'll let you go first. So that's an example of being diplomatic in a situation where you're letting them have that little success, if you will, without letting yourself get upset and overwhelmed by having the back and forth with them, especially. So that's important.
Okay, well, that's a good tip. I'm trying to think of situations that I've experienced like that and how I've reacted. Yeah, there is kind of a tendency, wait a minute, I wanted to say something.
Yeah. Yeah. So in some ways, I mean, that's important to be able to recognize that and such, it's one thing to find your voice. It's one thing to learn to basically speak up in cases where you need to, but it's another thing in some ways to say, you know what, if you want to win this, you want to have this little battle, you go ahead and win this little battle, and that's fine. I'll give you this much, So it's okay to sometimes yield in some cases if it buys the peace for the time being in that situation.
But sometimes, Ali-John, I find myself triggered by the irritability of the person.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes you sometimes have to be careful about that, right? In terms of not taking that on in that way, and that's really important, like you're saying. We can sometimes choose to remain calm and choose to remain rational. In fact, that's one of the responses I've found that's been the most successful with a lot of people, that when they have a highly emotional sibling or irritable sibling in that way, you know. So to remain rational is a way in which you're sparing yourself of getting involved in that emotional tug of war. So that's key, especially in cases like that with narcissistic injury.
Right. I find myself mostly stepping away when that
Yep.
happens.
Yeah, sometimes you need to do that. You're absolutely right. Sometimes you need to step away when it gets too volatile, right? If the irritability is just too much and it becomes too overbearing, you need to draw the line and say, okay, I'm done. And you throw in the towel, you know? So that's perfectly fine. I think that sometimes we need to do that. And walking away is sometimes the best solution with regards to that. So
I have a girlfriend who says, I can't work with this. That's
like
how I
that.
feel. I can't work with this.
I like that. That's it, you know, and that's it. You can choose just to walk away and leave that be and such, you know, and to recognize there's going to be other moments where perhaps they won't get triggered as much if you're still frequenting them, you know, in that way. But there's also like different strategies, you know. I mean, being very rational can sometimes be a little bit like gray rocking in that way as well.
Right. You can't argue with a rock.
That's right, you know, and you can't argue with somebody that may agree with you as well. So,
Right.
so that's the thing that's also interesting. So, Fern, I think we've covered a lot of different bases here. I think this is especially important, you know, and I also want to mention just maybe one last thing I think is it's important also to consider is the idea of being careful not to enter their personal space. You know, because our nature would be that if we've hurt somebody's feelings, we want to get closer to them in that way, or kind of in some way soothe them, right? And that doesn't work with a narcissistic sibling, you know, so that can actually trigger them even more. So it's best in that way to kind of give them space, so that way, you know, it helps them to recompose themselves ultimately.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So not something I'd ever thought about. I don't get too close to those narcissists if I can avoid them.
Well, you know, family settings, it depends how people are sitting, where people are standing and such, you know, but if you're conscious of that, you're going to be thinking more along those lines, you know. So yeah, so I think we've covered a lot, Fern, I think today. I think already, you know, I think is important as well. And I mean, in terms of what we've discussed, and yeah, I think that being conscious of that, and being aware of the things that we can do that are within our control is what's especially important in terms of narcissistic injury. So we're just about out of time, Fern. I'm just looking at the clock here. We're going to need to wrap this up for today, but it's always a pleasure to be able to talk with you, of course, and a few resources that our viewers know. My number one resource, I think, at this time is the Facebook page, Sibling Estrangement, Sharing, Coping, Connecting. It's a thriving community. I encourage our viewers to go and take a look at that.
Wonderful. And I would say my number one is the Sibling Estrangement Journal, where you can write your way into well-being. And I just wanted to conclude by saying I've seen a number of diagrams on your page, and they show exactly what you can control in your life. And what I've discovered is what's in your control or influence is how much access to my life I can give my sibling, whether or not I forgive them, how I communicate my boundaries, how much effort I put into the relationship, and how I choose to live my life. Everything else is out of bounds.
So important for us to remember, right? So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for being here, Fern. And I very much look forward to our next video together.
I do too. Great.
All right.
Thanks.
You take care.
Bye.
Bye now.